Okay, the first thing, Ruchir, that you're forecasting is there's going to be a long grind. By long grind, you mean there's going to be no bust and no boom. It's not going to be a dramatic recession. You're saying there's shorter recessions now because of easy money, higher government spending and low interest rates. And if you look at the shorter recessions according to Ruchir, in pre-World War II, the percentage of time that there were recessions was 44%, nearly half the time the economy was in a recession. Then from World War II till 1979, almost 20%, 18% of the time was in recession. That's high. Now, because of this easy money era, it's down to half that and 1/4 what it was. This is a huge change.
Yeah, I think that this has a lot to do with the role of government stimulus, government intervention, that in the pre-war era, there was very little of government intervention in economies such as the United States or the developed economies of that era.
Right.
And it's really since then that you've seen much more government intervention, and especially in the last 3-4 decades, as inflation was declining, every time there was the slightest trouble, because inflation was low and falling, the governments and central banks were able to come out there and put out a lot of stimulus. And that was particularly true in the pandemic, that we saw stimulus like never before during the pandemic.
It's amazing data, 44 to 10%. So you're saying John Maynard Keynes was right?
Well, in terms of, I'm not sure right or wrong, but he clearly had the maximum influence on policymakers and generally on economists.
And as you were saying, your data shows that in this long grind ahead, government stimulus or rescues increase sharply, leading to shorter and fewer recessions. Look at your data on stimulus as a percentage of GDP. It used to be 1% in 1990.
Right.
And now it's 46% this time. Amazing change.
Yeah, but the downside of this is the point that we made earlier, that because of so much stimulus, so much intervention, are we keeping too many inefficient companies alive? Are we not allowing the natural process to play itself out? Where a lot of zombie companies and other dead wood gets cleaned from the system. So that's the downside. But the long grind that I'm forecasting now refers to something a bit different, which is that we've been in this era now, as I said, that as you had declining inflation and you kept getting lower and lower interest rates, and the governments were able to stimulate and also cut short recessions. The problem now is that inflation, I think, is likely to remain stickier. Inflation has peaked and is coming off in many parts of the world. But the 2% inflation that we had for much of the developed world is likely to be more like 4%. Why? Because the demographics have shifted. The people's attitude towards work has shifted. So even now, if you look at it, the global economy has been slowing down, and yet unemployment rates around the world are close to record lows. So it's very hard to get people to come back into the labor force. A lot of people are still living off a lot of the stimulus that was put during the pandemic. In fact, some research shows that nearly half of that excess savings that people built up because of the massive stimulus following the pandemic is still sitting in people's banks accounts. So, like the whole idea being that provides a cushion. The problem is this, that delays the inevitable, which is that you have so much monetary tightening, and yet the global economy has been relatively resilient so far. But the problem is that once those savings run out, and then the recovery time starts, the recovery may also be soft.
Much longer.
And the shape may look like a long smile
instead of a kind of a V.
Exactly.
The old recessions used to be a sharp down and a quick sharp up. Now you're saying it's going to be a long grind, a kind of a, not a V anymore.
Yeah, and that's because inflation is likely to be stickier, and because of stickier inflation, the capacity of governments and central banks to stimulate will be much more limited. So therefore, I feel that we're in this period of the long grind.
Finally, I just wanted to look at your data on this long grind and what are the implications for India. And they're quite important, very, very serious actually. Because as the world slows, so will India slow down. Because historically, India's growth rate, according to all Ruchir and his team's data, India has been only slightly above the world in terms of growth rate. So if the world slows down, India's growth rate is unlikely to be above 5%. Now, historically, India's growth rate has been above the rest. Look at the world on average has been 3.4% growth rate. India has been 6.1. So India has been 2.7% above the world. And compared to emerging markets, India has been 1.6% higher than the growth rate. Now, explain what happens. If there's this long grind, what are we looking at?
No, the point that I'm trying to make here is that we underestimate systematically, and this is a debate I've had with so many people in India, we underestimate the global linkages. India's growth rate is very tied to what happens to the rest of the world, at least at the margin. There's a 70% correlation between India's growth rate and the rest of the world's growth rate. And the point is that it is very difficult for the Indian economy, and at least historically so, to grow that much faster than the global economy. It's quite significant that we have grown nearly 3 points faster than the global economy, but it's impossible to sustain a growth rate much above that is what we have seen. Even during the boom years of the 2000s, compared to the developed markets and even other emerging markets, India's growth rate was capped beyond a point. So I think that if the global economy slows down in 2023 as we forecast to about 2% or so, then India's growth rate is likely to be closer to 5% based on this historical fact pattern.
That it really gets capped. I mean, even 3% higher than the rest of the world is pretty high.
Yes.
But if the rest of the world is slowing, it really slows down India.
Yes, and the problem here is that we make our forecast quite insulated from that. We keep talking about 6%, 7%, 8%. Those growth rates were possible in the 2000s. But at a time when the global economy is going to be growing at 2%, then for us to grow much above 5% is going to be nearly impossible until something very dramatic, China-like happens out here.
That's really fascinating, and one has to take this into account in all policy decisions. That is 5% now, and how do we tackle that in the economy?